Hey friends, welcome to the first opening introductory video for our fall Bible study series on the letter to the Philippians from the New Testament. You know, before we go any further, this is probably one of those times where we should just name the weirdness right now, to use the old expression to recognize the elephant in the room. I don't just mean Phil here, this is just where he sits. I mean that here we are in the fall of the year. Our two congregations, New Life and Hope Lutheran Church, are used to gathering for a fall Bible study series in person around tables with coffee brewing off in the distance and papers in hand. And things are different right now. We're living still trying to figure out this reality of life on this side of the coronavirus and COVID, doing things, trying to be mindful of the many ways our lives are different, trying to return to what normal looks like, knowing that everybody is at a slightly different point as far as what they're comfortable with, what they're okay with, and also knowing that we've got folks scattered all over creation, not just living close to our two congregations. And so we thought this would be a helpful way for us to approach doing a fall Bible study series this year. You can join us. Hopefully you'll be willing to join us for our Zoom live conversations we'll be doing on Zoom. The good news is you can be participating on Zoom from home, from wherever you've got internet, by video, or dialing in by phone and participate in live conversation. But if you can't do that or don't want to do that, you can just participate by going along through the chapters of Philippians with us in these videos and in the study materials that we're going to be sharing along the way as well. But maybe this is a moment, like I say, to acknowledge the elephant. And as I've become fond of thinking over the years, to acknowledge that the elephant is in the room and to ask it to dance. So here we are in an empty church building when we would like it to be full and busy with lots of things, and circumstances mean that's not happening right now. But we don't give up on being church. We just keep looking for new ways to do what the followers of Jesus do in whatever the circumstances are. And in that sense, there's a lot of things we can learn from the letters of the Apostle Paul and the life of the early church that we get in the New Testament. Because I don't know about you, but these days I have often felt like, and I've heard a lot of people say, it feels like we're building the plane, we're already flying in as we fly in it. In other words, we're flying by the seat of our pants and making things up as we go, and sometimes that feels really uncomfortable for us, especially us church folk who are used to doing things in a traditional way, the way we've always done it, and especially for Lutheran church folks like me who are used to, we do everything the way the book tells us to, write it right out of the hymnal, that tells you the right order, or say it just the way you memorized it from the catechism. And these days it feels like a lot of the textbooks, the guidebooks, all the things that we're used to as traditional have had to be set aside as we figure out new ways to be church. Guess what though? That's how things began for us. So maybe it's important for us to name, there are some things about this moment, this time and place of being church that feel weird, that feel different, that feel out of sorts for us. I mean, one, everybody says these are unprecedented times. We feel like we've never lived through a situation like this before. And yeah, a worldwide pandemic, yeah, it's been since the flu of 1918 that things have been quite like this in the ways that our lives and businesses and the usual order of the day have been upended. So yeah, so even though I'm sick and tired, and probably you are too, of hearing people use the word unprecedented, that's what we're living in. We should probably be honest too. Part of this moment and what makes it feel so weird is we can't all be together. We can't be in the same room together. Again, some part of that is the distance of our lives as it is. But on top of that, COVID means that there are some folks who want to be a part of Bible study who just can't be in the room with us or aren't ready to. And other folks who, you know what, I've got to decide between going to Bible study and being able to take care of my grandmother who's at risk. Or going to Bible study and being able to work at my job where I'm working in the medical field and don't want to risk passing on sickness to somebody else. Or I can't afford to lose my job, but I don't want to be missing out on Bible study. We can't all be together. That's something we got to name. That feels weird. There's also a certain amount of just uncertainty in the air. There's some sense, everybody's got a different feel of how much the risk is, but there are risks if we get too many people together in one place, especially if there are folks who are at risk for getting sick or passing it along to somebody else. And we don't go around wearing t-shirts that say, "Hi, I have a compromised immune system," so you don't know. And so there's this, in the back of our mind, it feels like this sort of background noise. There's danger, there's risk at least, when we're all together. And maybe we should be honest too, that brings about a longing, a feeling of missing being together, and that we remember a time when we were all together, when you were, if you were a part of Bible studies in past years, you've been around the table, you get to know familiar faces, we get to know what kinds of insights or thoughts people will share. We value that being in the same space together and having lived through the same study together, and right now it feels like we're missing it. So yeah, let's name those things. Let's ask that elephant to dance. Because it turns out there's a lot about our setting that is exactly what Paul was going through as a writer, as the apostle, as a leader of the missionary church in the first century. His times were unprecedented, right? We're used to saying that about our day and age, but my goodness, they were literally inventing what it was to be Christian, to live out the life of following Jesus there in those first generations. And while Paul wasn't one of the original 12 followers of Rabbi Jesus in Palestine, he's this early leader who was the first to take this out beyond the bounds of Judaism, beyond the bounds of people who were ethnically Jewish, and to say that anybody, Gentiles, Jewish people, Samaritans, men, women, rich, poor, free, slave, educated, uneducated, women, men, everybody, that this belonged to everybody. And that meant figuring out, how do we do that? How do we bring the news of Jesus to people who didn't grow up going to synagogue and hearing the stories of Abraham and Sarah and the Exodus and King David and all the rest. So Paul's times were unprecedented too. And as much as we feel unsteady, how much more so for someone at the beginning of this adventure, literally figuring this out as he went along. Paul also had the struggle of not being able to be together with the people he cared about, the people he was trying to teach, the people he was trying to write to. And what we have in the letter we call Philippians exists because Paul couldn't be in the same room with them. If he had been in the same place, he could have just said, "Well, listen to what I have to say." Nothing would have been written down. But because Paul is separated and can't be with the people in Philippi, the Christians in the Roman colony city of Philippi, he wrote to them. And we now have what's left of that conversation in the letter we call Philippians. But Paul, when he writes this, is in prison. He's under something like house arrest, probably in the heart of the empire, somewhere in Rome, awaiting trial in front of the emperor himself. We'll have that conversation a little bit later on down the road, but that's why Philippians exists, is that Paul can't be in this church that he had been instrumental in getting started. So he had been there, he had had a really good time serving and living and leading and teaching and sharing the good news with people there. He continues on his travels, eventually gets arrested, appeals to the emperor, and is probably under house arrest somewhere in Rome when he writes, but that means he can't be with the people he cares about, and he does care about them deeply. That also means that in Paul's context, there's a lot of uncertainty and danger in being together. Paul's imprisonment is a reminder. The world in which he lives was very suspicious of this new community called the followers of the way. Before we were called church, or before we were called Christians, we were called followers of the way. And there was hostility from a bunch of different directions. There was hostility from the empire, from the Romans themselves. Even though it would get worse generations after Paul, it was beginning to be hostile in the empire itself. Because at the heart of the Christian faith is this announcement that Jesus is Lord, and therefore Caesar is not. That you can't replace Jesus with Caesar and things work out okay. Jesus is Lord. That means the empire doesn't get the last say, isn't the be-all, end-all, and the empire doesn't like that. So there's beginning to be hostility toward Christians from the empire standpoint, and from the respectable religious crowd back in Palestine, back in Jerusalem. There are folks who were upset at this Christianity thing because it doesn't look like Judaism, and yet it talks about being Jewish. And here's this difficult thing Christianity was figuring out. Are we a branch within Judaism? Are we a new religion altogether? Are we somehow both at the same time? And so there's a lot of uncertainty and a certain degree of danger for Christians to get together. In fact, in the early church, we didn't meet in church buildings with pews at all. That took centuries before we owned our own big spaces to have buildings that were dedicated just as church spaces. We met in people's houses. Maybe if you were one of the wealthier Christians in a place and you had a large enough house that had sort of an open plaza or a terrace in the middle of your house, that's where folks gathered. But it was in people's houses, big or small, but not in public. That was still dangerous. And in the heart of the empire in Rome itself, we met in the catacombs, in the underground passages and burial places for a long time. So yeah, the reasons for the danger of gathering together are different, but Paul knew exactly what it was like to be separated and not to be able to be in the same place with the Christians he wanted to write to. And then last of all, Paul had had the experience, and so did the Philippians he was writing to. They had remembered a time when they were all together. There had been a time where Paul had been with the Philippians. He started that congregation. There's some amazing stories that come out of the book of Acts about Paul's time there. Amazing transformation happened in people's lives there. And Paul was at the beginning of it. So they had good memories of the time Paul had been with them. And then he had to go on his way to other adventures, other journeys. And so as he writes, they all have in their memories, boy, wasn't it great when we could be together, and we can't right now, but we still got to keep going on. In so many ways it feels like this moment is ripe for a conversation exploring Paul's letter to the Philippians, because there's a lot about this moment we're living in that feels an awful lot like what Paul and the early church had to go through as he wrote to the Philippians. And if that's the case, then there's a lot we can learn. How do we face this moment that so often feels, again, to borrow that cliche word, unprecedented? How do we live through this time? Well, maybe there are things we can learn from what was important and what was life-giving for those early Christians who were figuring this out as they went along even 2,000 years ago in the first century in Philippi. So we invite you to be a part of this study series for exactly those reasons. Okay, so that's some of our context, what's going on in our world. And it sure does sound like it lines up with a lot of what Paul was going through as he wrote to the Philippians 2,000 years ago. Let's take maybe an overview, sort of a look, the view from 50,000 feet of what's going to be going on here in this letter. First, let's be clear. What is it that we're reading? Other books in the Bible are stories, or are genealogies, or books of laws, and Paul's letters are letters. The sometimes churchy word we use is epistle. That means it's sort of got a little tighter structure than just sort of the loose way you might rattle off an email or a text message to somebody. And these letters are more like a public letter. So it feels more like reading a letter to the editor in your newspaper, or if you've read Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from a Birmingham jail, or even when somebody will post on social media or Facebook, here's a post that they've written as an open letter to people that is not just personal, although there will be some times in the book of Philippians where Paul calls out situations and people and situations by name that he knows and he's aware of. Mostly this is a pretty broad letter to a whole community of people. Many of them he knows and has spent time with, eaten with, grieved with, rejoiced with, and worked with. But some of them are just sort of in that broad community of the church at Philippi. It's also worth remembering this is one-sided, one-directional communication. And that's, again, a difference. Paul, when he's with the church in Philippi, they would have conversation back and forth. I like to imagine that at night, wherever Paul would be, they'd be having conversations and sitting around a table talking, eating and drinking late up into the night, talking, and he would be preaching, or they'd be listening, or they'd bring questions, and this would shape Paul's theology as much as he shaped theirs. But a letter is more one-directional, and let's be honest, that's part of what this is right now. These video pieces of our study feel a little one-directional. I hope that what we bring to this study isn't just one-directional, that you'll offer your input, thoughts, questions, ideas, comments, and you'll help shape the theology of this conversation when you join us on Zoom, or if you send in email notes or comments or questions along the way. But I get it. Part of the study is going to feel like one-directional. And that's kind of how the letter works too. Now, another thing to say. As Paul's writing, what does he think he's doing? Well, it's probably more in Paul's mind that he's writing thinking, my goal is to shape the life and the faith of these people as they live out their lives in Christ exactly where God has put them right here and now. In other words, he's thinking his words are there to help shape the kind of people they become, the way they live out their faith, not I'm writing the Bible. I mean, yeah, Paul's words have now come to be part of our Christian scriptures that we treat as normative and authoritative and inspired from God. But as Paul's writing, probably he's not thinking this is going to be bound up in leather pages somewhere and that someone's going to keep this on their shelf as the Bible. He's thinking immediately about the people he knows in Philippi, their lives, their needs, their situations. And most importantly, it's about how do you live out you're following Jesus in your daily life. Whether it's first century Philippi or for us eavesdropping 2,000 years later in our setting as well. It's almost like, if you remember that movie from some years back, it was a Richard Dreyfuss movie called Mr. Holland's Opus, where the title character is a high school music teacher, and throughout the whole movie you're watching his real big dream is to be a composer, to write the Great American Symphony, and at the end of his life other things have gotten in the way. He's raised a family, he's taught kids, all these things have been setbacks. He never gets around to writing and becoming the great composer he wanted to be, but at the end he sees he's touched all these lives and that they're his great opus. Their lives are what he spent his energy and his time on. And they play the song that he's written in the end, but they come to say, we're really what you've spent your life on, not just printed notes and ink on paper. In a sense, I think that's a really important insight. The goal of studying the Bible is not just to get head knowledge, is not just to be a master of words that are printed on a page. And as Paul was writing, he wasn't just thinking, I hope people memorize these words and then they'll know enough facts about God. But his intention is to write in such a way that helps us to live out our lives following Jesus wherever we are. All those things in mind then, okay, we're reading a letter and we're getting only half of a conversation. So just like if you listen in on somebody else's phone conversation, or only get to see half of somebody's text messages, or only look at your sent messages in an email chain, you know you're only getting half of the conversation. You can probably infer some of what's going on, but some of what's being talked about is definitely context dependent. So as Paul's writing, there are going to be times where we'll have to say, here's what's going on in Philippi, or here's what's going on in Paul's world that makes this so important. And that means part of what's going on in Philippi may or may not directly affect how we read this in our time. We've already mentioned there's a number of ways that Paul's situation parallels what it's like to live in the COVID era of fall 2020, the ways we're disconnected from each other, the way we feel uncertainty, the way we're living feeling like there's tension or animosity coming from different directions, maybe. But there are going to be some ways that our situation is quite different from Paul's. We'll have to address that. Also, personality is a piece of this. Paul brings a certain personality. There's going to be times where Paul's attitudes, his way of thinking, his way of phrasing comes through the same way your personality shines through in a conversation, the way my personality comes through. There are going to be points along the way where probably you're going to get a dose of me and my take on things. I'll do my best to say, as far as I'm aware, where my blinders are, my biases or my lenses are. I'll try and say, this is one of those places I think this is what's going on, but push back if there are places where you feel like, I think that's maybe more of you, Steve, and less of what's going on for Paul or the Philippians. Fair enough? Okay, we said we're reading other people's mail, but there's a central theme in this whole letter that is, in a sense, timeless. That people have come back to Philippians over and over and over again across the centuries, because among Paul's letters, it stands out for the way it brings to the fore the idea of joy in the face of suffering, joy in the face of adversity, joy in the face of difficulty. And when I say that's a central theme, I don't mean to suggest Paul sat down with the parchment and said, I'm going to write a letter about joy, or I'm going to write about looking up when things are getting you down. Paul's writing from his lived experience, and because that's what he's going through, that comes up. But it's not like some English teacher said, I want you to compose an essay on joy through adversity. It's more what's going on in Paul's world. So I want to suggest, this is why I wanted us to be here for this part of our video. This is one of my favorite paintings. This is a print I have of Emil Nolda's painting called Sunflowers in the Windstorm. And the reason I love it is it suggests a moment that many of us don't get the chance to think about or even look at. What do sunflowers do when there's a windstorm, when there's a thunderstorm? They're still out there. We're used to picturing sunny skies, blue skies, and sunflowers. We're just gazing up at the bright sun in the sky. But what do they do in times where there's a windstorm going on? And how do they hold on? Paul's letter is, in some sense, to me, the embodiment in paper and words of what this painting is all about how there's joy even in the midst of adversity, and that they don't cancel each other out. That the joy is real, and so is the suffering, and having joy doesn't mean we have to pretend there isn't suffering. And on the flip side, suffering doesn't cancel out the joy that's a part of our lives. So in a sense, Paul's written a letter that feels a lot to me like that painting by Emil Nolde. So the idea of joy through your circumstances, joy through Paul's difficult circumstances, it's this idea that bubbles up for Paul because that's where he's living. There's this beautiful line from a song that came out a couple of years ago. It's a song by the band Switchfoot, and the name of the song is Joy Invincible. And I love that idea, that God is the one who gives us joy invincible. But there's this recurring refrain in the song that goes, "Hallelujah, nevertheless, was the song the pain couldn't destroy." I love that line. Let me say it again. Hallelujah, nevertheless, was the song the pain couldn't destroy. In some ways, to be a follower of Jesus is to speak our alleluias, to sing our alleluias even in the midst of deep brokenness and suffering, and not to say our alleluias to silence everything else, to say you can't mention it when there are sad things, but to say when pain, when brokenheartedness, when loneliness, when loss, when just the heaviness, the weariness of life are there, we keep speaking, we keep singing our alleluias because God keeps bringing us to life in the midst of it. So in a lot of ways, we're going to be those sunflowers living through windstorms. That's an important part of what Paul is going through as he writes this letter, and that struggle is real. We'll experience it as we go through this study. Last thing to say about the context. What prompts Paul to write this letter at this particular time in his life? Well, he's in prison. I think we may have mentioned a little bit ago. He's probably under house arrest and waiting trial before the emperor, probably as he writes this letter. So it's quite possible he's in Rome waiting for his docket to get pulled up and for him to have to go on trial, but with guards around, whether at the door or sometimes he talked about actually being in chains. But Paul is in that position of being a holy troublemaker, and the empire knows it. So he's in prison. He wants to write to the folks back in Philippi, but he can't go visit them because he's in prison, so he writes the letter instead. And part of what's occasioned it is the Philippians, that church, that congregation had always been a big supporter of his. Since the time that community was founded, they had been a supporter of his as he went on other travels, as he visited other congregations, and he even mentions, we'll get to that in the last chapter of the book, that they have financially supported him in the past, and Paul mentions, I'm so thankful, even back from the old days, back in Thessalonica, you had helped support me, and so he wants to acknowledge that, and they've given him a recent gift through a courier, through a messenger they've sent, a guy named Epaphroditus. So it's his having come to Paul and brought him, who knows, money or food or books or something, but he's come, he's brought news, he's brought support and financial support, probably because when you're under house arrest you can't go get a job, so that Paul can keep living, and the Philippians, their care for him prompts him to write back, and probably that's also where he gets some of the news of what's going on in Philippi, so that he can share with them what's going on and what he has to say about it. There are going to be some other tensions, other situations going on in Philippi that will emerge as we get through, but those are some of the really important background things to know. Paul's under house arrest. That's the cloud hanging over his head all the time, and what's prompted the letter is this messenger called Epaphroditus has come and brought to Paul's attention some of what's going on. So there's the view from like 50,000 feet. Now we're going to get ready to dig into chapter 1 of the letter to the Philippians. So for this next piece, I'm going to invite you, if you want to watch and follow along, have your Bibles handy. We're going to be spending our time in chapter 1 of Philippians. Okay, so speaking of sunflowers, I wanted to take you out here to the patch of little growing sunflowers we have in our backyard. More about them in just a moment. But I want us to actually open up our Bibles to the first chapter of what we call Philippians. This is a good time for us to remember that what we call chapters and verses are obviously added a whole lot later on, centuries later, as Christians figured, boy, it would be helpful if we all want to get to the same sentence and talk about it, for us to have ways of coding them and being able to find them easily. So what we call chapters and verses added way, way, way later, as Paul's thinking big, big picture, one whole big thought in his letter, and we've added and found ways to break it down sentence by sentence or even phrase by phrase. But starting in what we call chapter 1. The first couple of verses are a greeting, because remember, we're reading somebody else's mail. We're reading a letter. And the standard way of writing a letter in the first century in the Roman Empire is you start out with naming who the sender is. So we're used to dear so-and-so, and that's who's going to receive it first, and putting who's the sender at the end or on the return address. But in the ancient world, we were talking starting out with who's sending the letter. So this starts out with Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus. We'll talk about that word in a moment. To all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the bishops and deacons, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, a couple things we need to say right there, even though it's just basically the opening. It's like the return address of the letter. Paul is writing with alongside the help and probably the scribal help, maybe even of writing with his own hand, of Timothy, who's another sort of the generation after Paul, but a leader who will come to be sort of a prominent leader in the next generation of church leadership. Paul and Timothy are writing to, you'll notice he says, the saints who are at Philippi. Saints is one of those words, we sometimes treat it like the very, very special people who have halos on their heads in paintings. But in the ancient sense, in the original sense for the early church, anyone who's a follower of Jesus is given that designation. You're a holy one. You've been made holy. The word saint just means a holy one. Holy person, not because of how great or awesome you are, but because God's love has claimed you and set you apart for a different way of living, for a way of life of following after Jesus. So this isn't written to just like a special like VIP section in the church who are called the saints, and then there's the rest people who are just, regular churchgoers. This isn't like the church council or the Sunday school teachers or the altar guild. This is everybody, all of you who are followers of Jesus in Philippi, and including, then Paul says, the leaders. The titles he uses get translated bishops and deacons. These are just words. They weren't churchy words really yet. They weren't like official titles per se, but in the early days, their leadership was so much more functional, so much more who's going to be in charge of making sure we take care of everybody's needs? Who's going to make sure we're in charge of, we have teaching? Who's going to be in charge of overseeing our life together? The word bishop is the original word is just the word for overseer, someone who's going to supervise. The word deacon just means someone who serves, like who waits at table, like a waiter or server at a restaurant. And even Paul's word to describe himself, he doesn't pull out his authority. He doesn't say, I, Paul, an apostle. We'll get there. But he says, I'm just a servant. I'm just, even the Greek has an even stronger sense. It's less like a servant, like a butler, and more like a slave, like someone who belongs to the master. And again, first century slavery in the empire is different than what chattel slavery looked like in the American South in our history. So maybe that word is loaded baggage. But the idea when Paul says servant, this is not somebody who could walk away from the job if he gets a better job, or someone who walks around like a butler just serving tea to somebody who doesn't do anything. This is a servant who is working for a master that he cares about and whose life and well-being is invested in belonging to the master. So this is how Paul sees himself. He's a servant, and that's maybe all we are. That's where the letter begins, with Paul naming himself as a servant. Okay, so let's move on then. He's writing now, he's going to name who he's writing to. And one of the features of an ancient letter is that, especially in Paul's pattern, is that after he says who he is, hi, this is Paul, he breaks into thanksgiving to God for the people he's writing to. This is a way of establishing good relations, a way of saying to them, hey, I care about you. Hey, I remember good things that we used to do together. Or I'm so thankful because of this or this or this. It's not only a good way to start a conversation, it's on a positive note, but it's also a way of framing things that he reminds them that God's up to something through them. So when he gives thanks to God for them, he's reminding them God is at work in their lives and through them. So Paul goes on in the next several verses, I thank my God every time I remember you, constantly praying for every one of my prayers for all of you, because of your sharing in the gospel from the first day until now. I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. It is right for me to think this way about you, because all of you hold me in your heart, and you share in God's grace with me, both in my imprisonment and in defense and confirmation of the gospel.
For God is my witness that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight to help you determine what is best, so that in the day of Christ you may be pure and blameless, having produced the harvest of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ for the glory and praise of God. Man, that's a good way to introduce a conversation, right? Starting out with, "Hi, it's me, Paul. Man, am I thankful to God for you." Even right there, even if we didn't get any further, that's a really helpful idea. What if we saw all of our relationships with other people first through the lens of, what am I thankful to God about this person for? And can I find something that I want to bring out that will encourage them to be that or do that even more? And then on top of that, how can I help them to see that God is at work through their lives, whether they were aware of it at the time or not? Okay, so in addition to Paul offering this thanksgiving, which is part of his usual pattern, notice what he said he prays for these Christians in Philippi. It's interesting. He doesn't pray for the kind of things that usually fit in our prayer list. He doesn't say things like, I pray that you would all be successful or wealthy or that you get that job you're hoping for. But what Paul says is, I pray that your love would overflow. Isn't that interesting? Paul says, I pray that you would grow in your ability to love other people, one another, and everybody else. Of all the things Paul thinks that they need, he wants them to be able to love more fully, to love rightly, to love more deeply. If we were unclear before this, what is the Christian faith really all about? It has everything to do with this, that we become people who are capable of loving more fully, more deeply, and more beautifully, more like Christ. Again, I think this goes back to what we said a little bit ago, that when Paul writes, he doesn't think, the end product of what I do with my life is a book of things I've written. He doesn't picture books when he thinks of his life's work. He sees faces. He sees people who are being shaped more and more into the likeness of Christ. And because God's already started that in them, that's why Paul's prayer is that God will bring you to completion. This idea of being made what you're supposed to be. And that's why I want us to come out here to see these sunflowers. So, note of personal confession. You may have heard some of our struggles over the summer with plotting and planting this section of sunflowers that got lost to groundhogs midway through the summer, and I was about ready to give up on them. And here we are. They've planted them again, and we've already had one blossom and a couple more. We're supposed to get enough warm weather. One more week we'll get some flowers to open up, I expect, before the end of the week here. But I live every day in the expectation that these things will come to be what they are meant to be. I mean, it's lovely that we got a bunch of green leaves, but what the sunflower is meant to do, what it's made to do, is to get to completion, to get to maturity, where the blossom opens up and the seeds can form, and this will then feed the next generation of birds and next year's sunflowers. That Paul says to these followers of Jesus, I'm convinced that God who's already started, God who's planted you, is going to make sure that you are brought to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. God has started something among us, and even when it feels like things get put on hold, or things get changed, or our plans get interrupted, God promises to bring us to completion, that we will become what we are fully meant to be. That's really how the early church saw what their Christian faith was about. Less about, if I do the right things, then I'll get to heaven when I die, but more about, my life is in God's hands, and no matter what happens then with my life, God is going to bring me to maturity, to completion, to be what I'm meant to be, to harvest, I guess you could say, to the point where I bloom the way I'm meant to bloom. So for a sunflower, it's great when you start out with green leaves, great when you grow nice and tall, but the promise is it's supposed to grow and produce the flower and then be what a sunflower is meant to be. That's sort of what God's promise is for us as well. Paul then moves on in the next chunk of the what we call chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, and talks about his own situation. I won't read all the verses all in depth. You can follow along. This is going to be chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. And what Paul says here is he talks about his own imprisonment. And he says, I'll just read a phrase here. I want you to know that what's happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel. So Paul doesn't see what's happened to him in prison as a loss or a defeat. He sees in this thing that looks like defeat, in this thing that looks like the empire wins because they imprisoned him, this is actually God's clever way behind the scenes of helping to spread the good news. Almost like the way, do you ever get thistles stuck in the fabric of your pants as you're walking somewhere through a patch of thistle or something? Those are seeds that then will spread somewhere else. So even though it looks like the thistle, gets destroyed, obliterated when you walk through, that's actually how it gets spread. Or like when you blow a dandelion, and you blow those dandelion tufts go all over, the dandelion looks like it lost. It looks like it got destroyed. but no, it's actually been scattered and spread. Paul sees his imprisonment the same way, because he had been all the way over in Jerusalem, on the far fringes of the empire. He gets arrested, he's put on trial, he waits in prison there, and then asks and appeals for him to go see the emperor. This is a thing that Roman citizens could do. You can read that story in the late chapters of the book of Acts. But as he's waiting for his trial, he's in Rome, on Rome's dime, waiting in Rome in the heart of the empire, which means as he gets the news of Jesus around, even to the people around him, even to the guards who listen to him talk and write and overhear what he has to say, they're learning about this way of Jesus right under the nose of the empire. And his house arrest is paid for on the empire's dime. So they've paid for him to be shipped from Jerusalem, where he was arrested, there to Rome. And there, every day, there in the heart of the empire, he's announcing that there's another Lord who isn't Caesar, it's Jesus. That's powerful. Paul sees that what's happened to him has actually been something for good. Now, Paul doesn't say, therefore, it's super fun that I'm under house arrest. He doesn't say, oh, it was all worth it. He just trusts that even in rotten circumstances, God's up to something. I think that's an important way for us to frame things too. So often we church folks are so quick to immediately look for something happy to say when something bad happens, instead of saying, you know what, God's at work in this. I don't know what God's going to be up to by the end of it, but I'm sure God's up to something. And to trust that even in the things that feel most like defeat, the things that feel most like loss, God's up to something really important and powerful there. So for us to recognize that puts us in the same state of mind as Paul is. The last piece of the chapter is where Paul then moves on to talk about what you might call his spiritual situation. Earlier he talks about his physical situation, being under house arrest under the guards in the Roman Empire. Now he's going to talk about how that's all percolating and working on him inside his heart and inside his soul. That's the last part of chapter 1. So in the last few verses of what we call chapter 1 of Philippians, Paul sort of moves from talking about being under house arrest and about how God's used that, and he starts to think about what does this mean for him. And it seems like just underneath the surface is Paul's awareness that things might not work the way he wants to, that it's possible he could have this trial before the emperor, and that he might not be found innocent. He might, in fact, be judged guilty and put to death. Now, the conversation about what Paul is charged with is probably in-depth conversation for another day. The short version is probably something like treason is what the empire is going to be accusing Paul of. Because again, you bring the announcement that there's another Lord, that Caesar isn't really Lord, but Jesus is. The empire doesn't hear that in terms of religion. The empire hears that in terms of you're saying that Caesar isn't the be-all, end-all ruler of all things, and yeah, that's what it is to say that Jesus is Lord. It means to give your allegiance to him and not to any other claimants to the throne. So, Paul's aware that his stance, announcing Jesus is Lord and announcing Jesus' kind of reign right under the nose of the Roman Empire, is not only going to get him into trouble, but it is quite possible that he could be found guilty and could be put to death. So Paul's sort of thinking out loud here, getting the Philippians ready. And he says to them, look, I'm prepared no matter what happens. Jesus, his famous way of saying it is, for me, living is Christ and dying is gain. And then he goes on to say, look, if I continue on living, if I get through this time and I'm living, that's great. That means I can be more useful to the people I care about. He imagines going back to the folks in Philippi or to the other congregations that he served, or going into new places and bringing the good news of Jesus to them as well. But Paul says, look, if it turns out that's not how things go, I'm okay with it. And again, he doesn't say if they put me to death, but that's kind of the unspoken subtext here. That's why Paul might possibly be confronting the end of his life here. Now, it's interesting that some people have thought, maybe, my goodness, is Paul depressed? Is he suicidal that he's talking about it's okay if I die? I don't think that's it. I think Paul just has this deep assurance that no matter what happens in life or in death, God's got him. He will write to the Romans later on in the 14th chapter. He says, if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord. So there's this sense of no matter what happens, he's going to be okay. He knows he's in God's hands. And he says, look, even if I depart, even if I die, I'm going to be covered. God's going to be okay. In fact, I'll be with Christ. It'll be okay for me. So you don't have to worry about me, Paul says. But if I die, I won't be here to be useful for you, and I'd rather be useful to you. So Paul comes to this conclusion. He ends the chapter with the idea, you know what, I have every confidence. I'm going to come through this so I can continue to be useful to other people who need me and who depend on me. Now, we don't know for sure what happens for Paul. We don't know how much longer he had or how long his ministry continued. But at least it's a way of reframing how we think about life and death. Instead of assuming that when God comes through, there's always a happy ending and you live longer, sometimes the reality of death isn't something we have to be afraid of. We face it, we grieve to be sure, but we don't have to be afraid of it in the same way, especially not our own death. Paul reframes this because he's confident of the resurrection and because he's most interested in how he can be most useful for the people he cares about. And that, to me, that comes back to his prayer from the very, very beginning of this chapter, where Paul said his prayer for the Philippians he's writing to is that they would grow in love more and more and more. In other words, that what mattered to them is how they can show love to other people. Paul's grown himself in a lot of ways there. And his deepest wish is, I want to be most useful. However I can be useful, let that happen. Even if it would be more comfortable or easier for me not to have to go that route. So that brings us to the end of chapter 1. We're going to have more conversation as we keep going through this book of Philippians. We invite you to join us for future weeks as we work next week on the following Wednesday on the 30th. We're going to be working through chapter 2 of Philippians and what is probably one of the oldest songs of the early Christian community. And we invite you to join us next time. Thanks for being a part of our Bible study.